So you're probably watching this video because you've been looking for a budget wireless microphone system. And spoiler alert here, I'm not going to trash the Comica Boom X-D. It's actually a good little system for the money. But there is one little quirk, and we're going to talk about it here. So watch this space. I must admit, when I first started using the Comica Boom X-D wireless mic system and recording into my camera, I felt that the audio sounded a little thin, meaning it was kind of lacking bass. So I thought, how can I test this to see what's going on, comparing it with other microphones? So this is by no means a scientific test. It's kind of a kludge up, but nonetheless, it does show generally how the microphone system responds to audio. And the way I did that was I started with this function generator app, which is in my tablet, coupled that via Bluetooth to a, again, non-calibrated soundbar, a consumer soundbar, and put the microphone or microphones about 1 meter away from it just to see how they respond over the frequency band of 20 hertz to 15 kilohertz approximately. So this is what that sweep sounds like. So that's the test signal for our unscientific test. So let's check out the results from that test. So let's start with a reference point. This is the spectral plot that Audacity creates once you input that sweep signal through each of the mics. And we're going to use the Zoom H1N and its built-in stereo mics as a kind of a reference. So a couple of things to note here. This extends from looks like about 80 hertz up to more than 20 kilohertz, but we're rolling off somewhere around 15 or less. But a couple of things to notice here that are interesting are these peaks. Now, we're not dealing, as I said earlier, with a scientific setup. This is a very live room, and this is probably a room resonance, as is probably this and maybe these peaks as well. So we're going to kind of, notice those, but ignore them in a sense because they don't come into play when it comes to comparing our standard here, which is the Zoom H1N mics with the Comica lav mic and transmitter receiver system. So for instance, let's go over to the next slide, which shows the Comica lav. And that's, in this case, directly plugged into the H1N. And look at this. If I go back to the Zoom, you notice below about 200 hertz here, you get this roll-off using the Zoom mics, which kind of surprised me because I've always thought they were a nice broadband mic. But the Comica, going through the Zoom H1N, again, it's not the electronics in the H1N that's changing anything, it's just the mics, certainly preserves the low end right down, looks like well below 80 hertz. So that's kind of interesting that it explains why this lav mic to me sounds nice and warm. It's got this flat-ish sort of low end to it. But look now what happens when we go from plugging the lav mic directly into the Zoom H1N and then plugging it into its own transmitter and then running the line output from the receiver, the Comica receiver, into the H1N. So now we have a radio link essentially between the lav mic and the recording medium, which is the H1N. Let's go back and forth here. So look at that low end. It just suddenly rolls off. And if we look at this point, which is 1,000 hertz or 1 kilohertz, it seems to be that point around which the thing rolls off. I mean, we can see that they're above 1,000 hertz, slightly above. You still see that room resonance or whatever it is, peak. Maybe that's due to the speakers as well. But then when you go through the transmitter, we got this, I consider a severe roll-off. Let's just have a look at the numbers here. We're at 36 dB at 80 hertz and down to 54 dB. That's almost 20 dB of drop at the sub 100 hertz range, which I consider a bit severe. The other thing to look at too is, even though I said let's ignore all these peaks up here for now, you notice this area here, which is kind of the mid-range, where most of the voice frequencies are. If we go through the transmitter and receiver again, you notice there's a dip there. So it kind of is a very mid-range or less than mid-range sounding microphone once you plug it into the transmitter and receiver system, which is, that kind of explains a lot. Also down here, you'll notice there's a bit of I think it's more of an artifact than anything that creates this hump. And you'll see that in subsequent slides as well, wherever we're using the transmitter and receiver. But we can ignore that for now. But again, it's this severe roll-off at the low end that kind of had me bothered. And it certainly explains why I think it sounds kind of thin when I plug it into the transmitter and receiver and use it as a wireless microphone. So just to be sure that this wasn't a problem with the transmitter per se, they do supply 2 transmitters with this system and only 1 receiver. So let's just look at running that exact same lav mic through transmitter 2. You can see that, within the conditions that we're working in, which is kind of sloppy and subject to variability in room acoustics, that for all intents and purposes, they're exactly the same. So it's not the transmitter that's at fault in terms of rolling off the low frequencies in the mid-range. Using that same transmitter, transmitter 2, let's now compare the built-in mic on the transmitter 2 with the lav mic going into transmitter 2. And we can see on the low end there's really no difference between the two, nothing significant anyway. There's a little bit of a change in this mid-range. It looks like the built-in mic might be a little bit punchier than the lav mic. And if we go back to the lav mic alone right now, you'll see there is a little bit of a dip there, and it could be due to the characteristic in the lav mic. But if we go to the built-in mic and compare that to the lav mic going through the transmitter, there is a slight difference, but nothing at the low end. I couldn't help but notice that when I plugged my headphones into the Comica receiver headphone jack, that I thought I was hearing very good quality coming out of it. And I thought, well, why does that, once it gets into the camera, why does it sound a little thin? So what I ended up doing was, instead of coming out of the line output from the receiver into the H1N, I came out of the headphone jack. And suddenly, that low end now lifts up quite a bit. It's about 42 dB at 80 hertz, and then about 12 dB lower if you go through the line out jack. So unfortunately, when I come into my Fuji X-T2, I can't crank the gain down enough, nor on the receiver, the Comica receiver itself, to keep the levels from clipping. So unfortunately, I can't use the headphone jack to output to the camera. But I thought it kind of interesting that they would make the response of the headphone jack so much different from that of the line output jack. And if we go back to the lav mic alone, and now compare that with coming out of the headphone jack on the receiver, they're not dramatically different. Yeah, there's all this sort of moving around of the spectral peaks in the high end, and there's this sort of artifact here in the very high end. But there's not a lot of difference other than a few dB. I think it's about 12 dB difference between coming out of the headphone jack and what's actually coming out of the lav mic into the H1N. And if you look up here, it looks pretty similar in that mid-range to what's happening from the lav itself. So the headphone jack seems to be the cleanest way to get the signal out of the Comica lav. But unfortunately, the level's too high for probably most cameras. Now, you could kick in a limiter or something if your camera has it and be able to use that. But I found it, even with the receiver output set down to the 0 dB mark, which is its lowest level, and level 1 on the microphone input on the Fuji camera, still couldn't control the levels well enough to have any kind of confidence. Well, right now you're probably thinking, what's he whining about? Why doesn't he just create an EQ preset in his video editor that he can invoke anytime he's using this microphone system? And that's true, you can. The problem is if you're doing, for instance, a boost for bass because the microphone system is lacking, then what you're gonna end up doing is dragging up noise. Anytime you're doing gain increase in a particular part of the frequency band, you're potentially dragging up noise. So as a compensation, because I can't use the headphone output with my camera system, I can't use the headphone output from the Comica into the camera, it just overloads it. In the interim, what I'm doing is I'm recording on this little H1N, and from the wireless mic, from the lav, I should say, and then taking that into the transmitter, and then now the receiver is recording a safety track onto the camera. So I hope this was helpful. Again, I'm not trashing the Boom X-D. It's a great system. It's very price competitive, and I would recommend it for any person who's looking for a budget wireless mic system to get started with. So if you like this content, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and if you would like to see more of this, please subscribe and click on that notification bell. Thanks for watching.